September 18, 1944. Near the German border in Lorraine, General Hasso von Manteuffel stood over a map that for the first time in months seemed to promise something he had almost forgotten: victory. Manteuffel was 51 years old. He was not a Nazi fanatic. He was a pragmatist, a master of armored warfare who had fought in Russia and North Africa. He had seen armies collapse. He knew the Wehrmacht was bleeding to death on two fronts. But on this morning, he believed he held a winning hand. Under his command stood the 113th Panzer Brigade. This was not the battered wreckage of Normandy divisions held together by hope and field repairs. This was Hitler's new Fire Brigade. Fresh formations sent straight from the factories. Some tank crews were still learning their turret mechanisms. The brigade was equipped with around 58 brand-new Panther tanks. On paper, the deadliest tanks on the Western Front. Manteuffel did the math with cold precision. The American M4 Sherman was a reliable workhorse, but it was a medium tank with a short-barrel 75mm gun. Its frontal armor could be penetrated by the Panther from over 2,000 meters away. The Panther's sloped armor could bounce American shells like ping-pong balls. At long range, a Panther's 75mm high-velocity gun could kill a Sherman from distances where the American gun was effectively useless. Manteuffel studied his fuel allocations. The 113th Panzer Brigade had been given roughly 600,000 liters of fuel. Enough, on paper, for 2 days of intensive combat operations. 2 days. That was all he thought he needed. His objective was elegant: slice into the exposed right flank of General George Patton's Third Army. Patton was overextended. His fuel lines snaked across more than 400 kilometers. His tanks were scattered across 180 kilometers of front. Manteuffel's plan was to concentrate his 58 Panthers and punch directly into the American 4th Armored Division. Cut off Patton's spearheads, destroy them in detail, create a crisis that would force the Americans to halt their entire advance in Lorraine. By conventional armor logic, this should have worked. The German tanks were superior. The German numbers were concentrated. The element of surprise was absolute. The Americans had no idea that a fresh Panzer Brigade was assembling in the fog and forests around Arracourt, Lorraine. But Manteuffel was making a calculation based on 1940 logic in a 1944 reality. He assumed a tank battle was decided by armor thickness and gun caliber. He did not know he was leading his brigade into a trap built from 3 things the German military mind struggled to comprehend: fog, speed, and math. At 7:30 on September 19, 1944, the lead elements of the 113th Panzer Brigade began their approach march toward their assembly areas. A thick, heavy fog rolled across the Lorraine fields like a living thing. Visibility dropped to 50 yards, then 30. Tank commanders peered through their periscopes. Drivers could barely see the tank in front of them. Manteuffel's greatest advantage, the long-range killing power of the Panther's gun, evaporated in seconds. A 2,000-meter kill shot requires sight. These Panthers could not see 50. The fire brigade was blind. Inside the American Combat Command headquarters, about 15 kilometers away, Colonel Bruce Clark began receiving reports from forward observers. Heavy engine noise, large tracked formations, moving west through the fog. Clark did not have heavy tanks of his own on hand. He had the 37th Tank Battalion, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams. a name that would one day sit on the front of America's main battle tank. Abrams did not panic. He understood instantly what that fog meant. If the Germans could not see at 2,000 meters, their superior gun was useless. This was going to be a knife fight in a phone booth. Speed and reaction time would matter more than armor and optics. The German column advanced through the mist, tank engines roaring, tracks clanking, commanders hunched low in their cupolas, expecting to roll through a thin American screen and then break out into Patton's rear areas. Instead, the lead Panther suddenly erupted in flames. Its turret was blown open, then the second Panther in column, then the third. German crews panicked. Radio discipline collapsed. Tank commanders swung their turrets left and right, desperately searching for muzzle flashes in the fog. They saw none. The shots were coming from their flanks. Rounds that could not penetrate the thick frontal glasses were punching easily through the thinner side armor. Voices crackled over the radio net. Enemy left. No, enemy right. Where is the enemy? Commanders popped their hatches to see over the fog and were cut down by unseen machine gun fire. To the men inside those Panthers, it felt like they had slammed into a wall of American heavy tanks. But the reality was far more disturbing. The 113th Panzer Brigade had not hit a wall. They had walked into a swarm. The swarm was made of M18 Hellcat tank destroyers. To a German tanker, the Hellcat looked like a joke. It had almost no armor. A heavy machine gun could punch through its turret. It had an open top, leaving the crew exposed to shrapnel and grenades. By Wehrmacht standards, which valued protection above all else, the M18 was a suicide machine. But the Hellcat had one statistic that Manteuffel's calculations had completely ignored: power-to-weight ratio. The Hellcat weighed about 17 tons, yet it was powered by a radial aircraft engine, the same type of engine used in American fighter planes. That engine produced about 350 horsepower. On roads, the M18 could reach speeds of up to 55 miles per hour, faster than any tank in the world. No Panther, no Tiger, no Soviet T-34. Nothing could match that speed. In practical terms, the Hellcat could relocate from one firing position to another faster than a medium tank, could rotate its turret. In the fog of Arracourt, that speed became the ultimate weapon. The German Panthers advanced in rigid formations like Roman legionaries in armored columns. They were designed to move in coordinated groups, overlapping their fields of fire and supporting each other's flanks. But coordinated tactics require visibility and reliable communication. The fog destroyed both. The American Hellcats fought like a pack of wolves. Individual hunters, working autonomously, coordinated not by line of sight, but by radio. Here is how the engagement unfolded, repeated dozens of times that morning. A Hellcat platoon from the 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion would hear Panthers approaching through the fog. The commander, listening on the radio, would plot their own position and the enemy's movement on a map. He would order his driver to race to a flank position behind a hedgerow, a barn, or a low ridge. The aircraft engine would scream at full throttle. The thin-skinned Hellcat would dart into place. The crew moved fast. The gunner settled behind the sight. The loader stacked armor-piercing 76mm rounds within easy reach. They waited, engines idling, eyes on the fog. Then hulking shapes would loom out of the grey. Panthers rolled past, presenting their vulnerable sides. The commander would bark the order. 3 high-velocity 76mm rounds slammed into the flank of a Panther. Penetration. Fire. The Panther's turret would start to slew toward the threat. But the Hellcat was already moving. The driver kicked the vehicle into reverse at full throttle. The light destroyer backed up hundreds of yards at frightening speed, guided by shouted directions from the commander. Within seconds, they disappeared into the fog. Then they reappeared 300 yards away on a different road, setting up a new ambush for the next Panther in line. Before the surviving Germans could complete their lumbering turret rotation, the Hellcats were gone. It was a clash of philosophies. The Germans built tanks as armored fortresses, heavy, protected, designed to take hits and keep fighting. The Americans built vehicles that were never supposed to be there when the hit arrived. Light, mobile, designed to shoot, move, and live to shoot again. By noon, the fog began to lift. Manteuffel, receiving reports of stalled attacks and rising losses, ordered his commanders to push harder. The Americans cannot be everywhere. Push through their screen. But as the sun burned away the mist, the Germans discovered the second layer of the American trap. During the opening hours, German Panzer Grenadiers had ridden on the backs of the tanks or followed closely in half-tracks. Their job was to protect the armor from American infantry with bazookas and mines. Now, as the sky cleared over Arracourt, something else found them. Not aircraft, not yet. Something even more precise, American artillery. Specifically, the 66th Armored Field Artillery Battalion, under Colonel Bruce Clark's direct control, was about to use a tactic that was standard doctrine for Patton's 4th Armored Division, but almost unknown to the Germans: time on target. In traditional 1940s warfare, artillery batteries fired in sequence. Battery A fired first. The enemy heard the first shells coming, dove into foxholes, and hugged the dirt. Battery B fired 10 seconds later. By then, most men were already under cover. The killing power of every salvo dropped sharply after the first few rounds. The American time-on-target method changed that equation. It was pure mathematics. A centralized fire direction center collected data from multiple batteries, often a dozen or more, spread miles apart, at different elevations and different distances from the target. The FDC calculated the flight time for shells from each battery to reach the same coordinates. Then it worked backward from a single desired impact time. Battery A, 12 kilometers away, might be ordered to fire at exactly 1200 hours. Battery B, 4 kilometers away, would fire at 12:05. Battery C, 8 kilometers away, would fire at 12:10. Every gun fired at a different moment, but every shell was timed to arrive on target at the same instant. When the fog lifted on September 19th, tiny Piper Cub spotter planes circled high over the battlefield. They looked like overgrown insects, but they were deadly eyes for the American artillery machine. From above, their pilots could see the German tank columns and Panzer Grenadiers moving below. They radioed coordinates back to the fire direction center. There were no warning shots, no ranging rounds. 1 second, the Panzer Grenadiers were crossing open, muddy fields alongside their tanks. The next second, the air above them simply disintegrated. Dozens of air-burst shells detonated at about 30 feet altitude all at once. Shrapnel fell like razor-sharp rain. Blast waves ripped through open ranks. Dozens died in the first instant. Dozens more were wounded. The shrapnel hardly scratched the Panther's armor, but it tore away something more important than steel. It destroyed the brigade's eyes and ears. External radios were smashed, radio antennas mangled, field telephones and command wires were shredded. Instantly, command and control disintegrated. The German tanks were stripped of their infantry screen, hatches slammed shut, commanders buttoned up, blind inside their steel boxes. A tank without infantry support is a dead tank. Without Panzer Grenadiers to protect them from bazooka teams, the Panthers were helpless. Without commanders looking out of their cupolas, they could not see the Hellcats flanking them. Without radios and telephones, they had no situational awareness. Manteuffel's elite brigade was not engaged in a normal battle. It was being processed by a machine. By the afternoon of September 19th, the fields around Arracourt were littered with burning Panthers. But the most shocking statistic was not just the tanks destroyed by fire, it was the tanks that simply stopped. The 111th Panzer Brigade, meant to support the 113th's attack, arrived late. Why? Because they ran out of fuel on the way to the battle. Germany had designed one of the most sophisticated tanks in history. The Panther boasted superb optics, interleaved road wheels, sloped armor, and a lethal high-velocity gun. But the Reich no longer had the fuel to move 58 of these machines 20 kilometers in combat. Meanwhile, Patton was also screaming about fuel shortages. His famous Red Ball Express truck convoys were stretched thin across France. American tank units were rationing fuel. But the difference between American and German shortages was fundamental. When American tanks lacked fuel, they shut off their engines and waited. When the trucks arrived, they refueled and rolled back into action within hours. When German tanks lacked fuel, they were often abandoned. Crews blew the gun breech with demolition charges. They sabotaged the engine to prevent capture. And then they walked away. As the battle raged over 3 days, the disparity became almost comical. American recovery crews towed damaged Shermans back to mobile repair depots even while the fighting continued. Mechanics working in open fields welded patches over shell holes, replaced engines, straightened bent gun barrels. Tanks knocked out in the morning could be refueled, given new crews, and sent back into the line by evening. The Germans had almost no equivalent recovery system. If a Panther threw a track, it was often abandoned. If its transmission failed, abandoned. If the engine caught fire, the crew bailed out and let it burn. There was no steady stream of spare engines or transmissions coming from factories. The Panther was a masterpiece, but it was also a dead end. The 113th Panzer Brigade entered the battle with about 58 Panther tanks. Within 24 hours, around 30 were out of action. Within 48 hours, roughly 50. By the end of the week, German records show only 8 Panthers still operational. The unit had effectively ceased to exist as a fighting force. In contrast, American Combat Command A of the 4th Armored Division lost 5 Shermans and 3 tank destroyers in the first crucial day. Total U.S. tank and tank destroyer losses over the week were about 25 vehicles. But critically, most American losses were replaced within days. New Shermans rolled forward from the rear. Within a week, Combat Command A's operational strength was close to, or even higher than, what it had been before the battle. Manteuffel was not just being defeated by tactics, he was being defeated by a supply chain that stretched across the Atlantic. Back through English ports, back through American factories in Michigan, New Jersey and Ohio, back to the ore mines of Pennsylvania and the oil refineries of Texas. He had built a perfect hammer, but the forge that made hammers for Germany was thousands of miles away, bombed and rationed by Hitler's own decisions. The Americans, by contrast, had built something else. They had built a factory that moved at 50 miles per hour, a factory with radios, a factory with supply trucks, a factory with spare engines, ammunition, and fuel. And in September 1944, in the fog of Lorraine, that factory beat the night in armor. On September 22nd, Manteuffel ordered the 113th Panzer Brigade to disengage and retreat. The great counterattack had failed. Arracourt is often forgotten. It sits in the shadow of D-Day, Operation Market Garden, and the Battle of the Bulge. It does not have the cinematic scale of those operations, but it might be the most important battle for understanding why Germany lost the war. Not because it was massive, but because it stripped away the myths. It proved that a superior weapon like the Panther is useless if it is blind, if it has no infantry support, if it cannot move for lack of fuel, and if it is outmaneuvered by swarms of lighter vehicles operating inside a better communication and logistics system. The Germans built warrior knights in shining armor. The Americans built a system of radios, supply trucks, repair depots, and standardized replaceable vehicles. At Arracourt, that system crushed the knight. General Manteuffel survived the war. In his memoirs about Lorraine, he admitted that American time-on-target artillery and the mobility of tank destroyers had made traditional panzer tactics obsolete. The Battle of Arracourt reminds us of a hard truth. It wasn't just courage. Both sides had courage. German soldiers were not less brave than American soldiers. What decided the outcome was the triumph of a system, a logistical system, a communication system, an industrial system, where speed, mobility, replaceable vehicles, and spare parts mattered more than individual warrior excellence. Thanks for watching Last Stand History. If you found this deep dive into how speed and logistics defeated superior armor useful, consider liking the video and subscribing for more forgotten World War II stories. Tell us in the comments, would you rather command a Panther with no fuel or a Hellcat with no armor? And where in the world are you watching from today? Your engagement helps us keep bringing these untold narratives to light. This video is for historical education only and does not promote or support Nazi ideology in any way. Subscribe for more stories of World War II and the real lessons of industrial warfare, as seen through the eyes of the people who lived it.